Glory to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. This video will be a continuation of the church history videos. The last few videos was during the time of Saint Photios of Constantinople, or Saint Photios the Great, in this particular playlist. So this video will continue on that particular playlist about church history. Now, in the previous few videos, I discussed some of the complicated history and a lot of what was going on between both the patriarchates of Rome and Constantinople, especially in the period during the iconoclasm and the second phase of iconoclasm, and then after the time of the triumph of orthodoxy in the year 843. Some of what was going on in the time of Saint Photios and the complicated dynamic between Rome and Constantinople at the time. And I'm not going to get too much into that in this video, except just to reiterate the fact that, remember, both Rome and Constantinople, in the time of Saint Photios, with the exception of the brief break in communion, it was technically restored. Communion was restored between Rome and Constantinople, with the exception of a brief break in communion in the middle of the 860s. But by the time of the late 860s, both Rome and Constantinople were both in communion once again. However, of course, Rome's patriarchate was falling further and further into heresy, with the resumption. Now remember, communion was restored between Saint Photios of Constantinople and Pope John VIII. And remember, from the Orthodox perspective, Pope John VIII is considered really the last of the more Orthodox-minded popes, because he did retract a lot of the heresies, such as the Filioque and papal supremacy. However, after Pope John VIII, of course, all of the popes after that, continuing on until the final unfortunate apostasy schism of the Papists in 1054, all of the subsequent bishops of Rome will be pushing the heresy, all of the heresies, such as papal supremacy, and enforcing it. Papal supremacy, the Filioque, and some of the other innovations that I mentioned in some of the previous videos, like the unleavened bread, the sprinkling for baptism rather than the full triple immersion, and some of these heresies that will continue for the next few hundred years until the final schism in 1054. Now, even though in the period after Saint Photios, for the next few hundred years until 1054, even though Rome and Constantinople are technically in communion with each other, a lot of the problems now between the two patriarchates will be over what is going to be happening within the Balkans. And that's a very big part of the subject of this video, though, but focusing, though, on, of course, Saint Cyril or Kyrillos and Methodius, the apostles to the Slavs, and who are considered to be equal to the apostles. But Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius, of course, are so important in church history because of the Christianization, the evangelization of the Slavic kingdoms to orthodoxy. Now, as we know up to this point, now I kind of started this video with the map as we see in the upper right hand corner at the year 867, so near the end of the time of Saint Photios in Constantinople. Now, within the few hundred years before this, within the Balkans and Eastern Europe and into above the Black Sea, we have the development of very important states that had developed. Now, if we go back just a few hundred years, just for a moment, to the 600s, we can see that, of course, before that we had the Avars, who were the Turkic Confederation. But remember, in numbers, the majority of the people coming in were the Slavs. And at the same time, the Bulgarians, the Bulgars, who were a Turkic tribe originally, related to the Khazars, who were another Turkic tribe, had migrated from farther east originally, as they were originally part of the Gokturk Confederation, which originally was more in the sphere of influence of China. But as we can see, this green here is the very powerful Tang China, where the Tang had pushed into Central Asia and pushed the Gokturks right out. And a lot of the tribes had migrated towards the west. And the two most prominent of these at this point, of Turkic tribes, were the Bulgars, I should say, the Bulgars and the Khazars. So if we go back a few hundred years to the middle of the 600s, this is where the Bulgars had primarily settled in the area of what is now, let's say, eastern Ukraine. And which what I've explained in previous videos, where it's hard to see on this map, but remember, like a lot of the tribes that going all the way back to the Huns had been invading Europe from further east within Central Asia. The geography of this area is that you have above the Black Sea in this area, it's relatively flat here, above the Caucasus Mountains, and in between the Black Sea, or like the Sea of Azov here, and the Caspian Sea here. This area is called the Pontic-Caspian Steppe, and this is where many of the tribes, as they come from the east, will many times settle, sometimes push beyond the Carpathian Mountains all the way into Europe. And this is the pattern that we saw with the Huns, and then the Avars, and now the Bulgars. Now, at some point, the Bulgars themselves we know that in the 600s, had a migration where they migrated under their leader Asparuk towards Constantinople, in their attempt, remember, to invade Constantinople, ironically. But they established their another settlement area in what was really the area of like old Dacia and northern Thrace. And the Bulgars, though, merged locally with the Slavic tribes. And this is where we have the ethnogenesis of the Bulgarians, who are, remember, their ethnogenesis is coming from the combination of the Bulgars, who were Turkic, the Slavic tribes in the region, especially who we call the 7 Slavic tribes in this region, and of course the people that were in the region from earlier times, like the Roman era population, who were descendants of the ancient Thracians and the ancient Greeks and people within this part of the Roman Empire, all contributed to the ethnogenesis of the Bulgarian people as we understand. Now, when the Bulgars had migrated into this area, the Bulgars, they weren't the only group of Bulgars. Some smaller groups of the Bulgars had gone into Italy, but they were so small that they just would have assimilated into the local population. The other group of Bulgars actually, there was another group of them that had split off in another direction, and they went all the way farther north, along the Volga River. These Bulgars became known as the Volga Bulgars, who would continue for several hundred years afterward. But the Bulgars were pushed out by their rivals, the Khazars. Now, the Khazars are somewhat notorious in history because a lot of times they're associated with the Jews, only because at some point we know that in the late 700s, the Khazars, at least their leadership, do convert to rabbinical Judaism. And then later on, of course, we know this group of Bulgars, the Volga Bulgars, later in the 900s, around the year 922, will actually convert to Islam. And there will be an Islamic state in this area. But that I will get to when we get up to that point, because the interactions with these two kingdoms will become very important, actually, as time goes on. Now, of course, as we moving forward, of course, back to the time period that this video is concerned with, as we move forward again to the 800s. The Bulgarians, of course, we know now for 200 years had been, of course, adjacent to the Eastern Roman Empire, but of course the Bulgarians themselves, the Bulgarian kingdom, was pagan. Remember, they were a mixture of Slavic paganism combined with the some of the shamanic paganism that the Bulgars had brought from Central Asia. But for the most part, they were pagan. It's not until the time of Saint Tsar Boris, in the 860s, who was the Khan of the Bulgars, the Bulgarians, who becomes Orthodox Christian and becomes the first Tsar. So the Bulgaria becomes the first Slavic Orthodox Christian kingdom or empire, we can say. We can say empire because, in a sense, it was quite multi-ethnic. So the Bulgarian Empire comes into existence as an Orthodox Christian state in the time of St. Boris, even though it had existed, of course, from the time of Asparuk, but as it was pagan at that point. So there are basically three Slavic states that are kind of the most important within this area, or I should say the most organized. That's the word I meant to say. It's the Bulgarians, of course, among the southern Slavic groups. Of the West Slavic tribes, there's a state that comes into existence, a more organized kingdom or state that comes into existence called Great Moravia, who are made of some of the West Germanic tribes. West Germanic tribes would be people that were the ancestors of, let's say, like the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Slovenians. Those are the West Germanic tribes, West Slavic tribes, excuse me. The Slavic tribes that were adjacent to the areas that are now becoming more German, which I will get to in a second, East Francia. And then, of course, we have of the East Slavic tribes, the state that will come into existence, or that around the 860s, is the Rus themselves, which I will get to in a moment. But between these particular three kingdoms, and then there are smaller tribes that will become also the Serbians and the Croatians, where some of these tribes somewhat overlap, where they will become, of course, important Orthodox Christian kingdoms. But now, for the most part, at this point, the most organized were the Bulgarians and the Moravians. Now, the Bulgarians had already become Orthodox Christian during this time. But now, in terms of Saint Cyril and Methodius, we have their interactions with the kingdom of Great Moravia, this Slavic state here. Now, both of the Bulgarian Empire and the kingdom of Great Moravia were in kind of an interesting situation that was somewhat awkward, but very tumultuous, in the sense that, remember, Rome was also trying to assert, the bishops of Rome were trying to assert their influence in the Balkans. Now, of course, both Rome and Constantinople were technically at this point still in communion with each other, but remember, Rome's patriarchate, as through the late 800s and into the 900s, is, as we know, very much controlled by the Franks, and they're beholden to the Franks. Now, remember, the Franks were the ones that had sort of given them, quote unquote, what was called the Papal States. Remember, I mentioned this in the previous video, the origin of the Papal States. That remember that originally the area in the central part of Italy, when it was part of the Eastern Roman Empire, was part of the Exarchate of Ravenna, which was the government of the Eastern Roman Empire in Italy to protect Rome's patriarchate. This is going way back to like the 500s, when Emperor Justinian had reconquered Italy from the Goths in earlier times. But of course, we know that during the Iconoclasm period, the Lombards conquered the Exarchate of Ravenna, and then the Franks conquered the Lombards, and then handed over that territory back to the bishops of Rome, but it became the Papal States, an earthly state directly controlled by the Bishop of Rome, which contributed a lot to their corruption. Also, when it comes to papal supremacy, and this idea of being kind of like earthly kings with an earthly government when it comes to the Papal States. But remember, now these Papal States, which is directly under the bishops of Rome, who rule it kind of like almost like dukes or kings, by this point, were beholden to the Franks, basically. But now there is a dynamic that happens with Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius, which is very, very important. Now, the Franks themselves, in 843, back in the time of the triumph of orthodoxy, remember, which we celebrate during Great Lent, the triumph of orthodoxy in 843, which was the final overthrow of the iconoclasm heresy in the East, which unfortunately the West didn't really triumph from, because the West just kept falling further and further into heresy. Well, remember, the East, that almost happens in the East. Remember, that's why the triumph of orthodoxy that we celebrate, the restoration of the holy icons, is so important, because it almost happens that Constantinople, like what would happen with Rome, would fall completely into heresy. But it didn't happen because of the great repentance and the triumph of orthodoxy. So it's very, very important for us to understand this. Now, with in the same year, in the West, in the year 843, at the triumph of orthodoxy, the Frankish Empire fractured into East Francia, Lotharingia, and West Francia. This West Francia is the origin of what becomes France. This Lotharingia and East Francia will eventually merge and become what's called really it's a more German empire. They will, of course, refer to it as Holy Roman Empire, but of course, as Orthodox Christians, we never accepted that title, because it was a title that was originally given to Charlemagne when Charlemagne was crowned by the Bishop of Rome. But we do not accept that title, even though that particular Bishop of Rome, other than that, doing that, was not so bad at that time. But he did do that action of crowning Charlemagne with the title of Roman Emperor, which as Orthodox we never accept that. And around this time, especially the kings of East Francia will start to assert that title but really it's more of a Germanic state. So this is the predecessor really of technically Germany, the way we understand it in the more modern sense, which will continue speaking the German dialects, whereas West Francia, the Franks in this area will transition more to speaking with the dialects of Latin that are gradually transforming themselves into the early dialects of French. Because remember, that's another thing that I mentioned in the previous video, is that as the West during the 800s and the 900s and the early 1000s starts falling further and further into heresy, there's a language issue. And this is where Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius are very, very crucial in this understanding. Because remember, in the earlier times when the West was Orthodox, it is true that the ecclesiastical language through most of the local churches of the West, going back from very early times, depending on the area, usually in parts of Italy it was still Greek, but in most of the West, in the Orthodox West, it was Orthodox Latin, because through most of the West, Latin was the primary spoken language. So the Divine Liturgy, as it was in the West, in the Orthodox West, was understood by the Orthodox population. Just like in the East, in the Greek-speaking areas, obviously the Greek was understood because that was the primary spoken language within the Eastern Roman Empire. Of course, there were places in the East where you had still the Orthodox speaking the Syriac language also, where it was still understood though. But you have, as the West during this time is falling further and further into heresy, there's a disconnect now between a lot of the population and the liturgical language still being Latin, and this will continue now during the period after 1054, when you have full papism, when the West completely falls into the Papist heresy of papism, where the Papists will always insist for many centuries to have their services only in Latin. Remember, at the expense of the population, who will not understand it really, because then they will have fully transitioned into speaking the local languages like Spanish and Italian and French and German and other languages, and even English when it comes to the Papist parts of this area. So, and part of that was also to suppress the people and to keep them from understanding really the faith and to challenge the Papist heresy. I mean, but I'm going to get to that when we get to that. But it's early. But um, uh, the early forms of this situation are happening during this time, as the Romance languages are just starting to develop, and this becomes an issue because as the Latin um, uh, 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 I should say, I'm trying to use the word like missionaries or the Latin people from the Latin West at this point, which is not fully Papist yet, remember, because we're still before 1054. But as they're going into Eastern Europe to try to convert many times the Bulgarians or the Moravians and all of these people within Eastern Europe, they will insist on using Latin and not using the language of the people, which in this case are the Slavic dialects. Now, that will be more of an issue with the clergy that are coming from East Francia. Ironically, not so much Rome itself, because there are some like windows of hope that were happening during the period of Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius, where the bishops of Rome would actually allow them to um, to uh, preach to the Slavic people in and create also the alphabets that will come into use for the Slavs, which will also be acknowledged by Rome at least during this period. Because remember, as much as the Rome's patriarchate, the popes at this time, were beholden to the Franks, there still was some disagreement and sometimes, which was a good thing, but sometimes some of a rivalry between the clergy among the Frankish areas and the clergy within Rome's patriarchate. Um, Eventually, that will kind of disappear when they become more fully Papist and more unified under Papism. But still, at least in the time of Saint Cyril and Methodius, there is sometimes some appeal to a more Orthodox-like way of thinking at this time. Now I will discuss more specifically Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius. Now, both Saint Methodius and Saint Cyril or Saint Cyril were born during the time of the second phase of the iconoclasm. Saint Methodius was born in around the year 815, and Saint Cyril was born in Thessaloniki. Both were born in Thessaloniki, actually, and both of them were actually during like I said, the second phase of the iconoclasm. And I just realized actually the fact that they were born in Thessaloniki, and that Thessaloniki also plays a very big role in Saint Cyril and Methodius and the conversion of the Slavs, is very, very important in terms of church history, because as we recall, going all the way back to the history of Thessaloniki, a very important Orthodox Christian city from the time of when the Acts of the Holy Apostles even in the Holy Scriptures. Because remember, when St. Paul was in Thessaloniki, we have this dynamic between, remember when the Jews in Thessaloniki were trying to attack St. Paul, when St. Paul was in Thessalonica, remember they say in their accusation that St. Paul and the apostles were trying to make the people go against the rulings of Caesar. Remember, it is a Caesar eventually that the decree of a Caesar that converts the entire Roman Empire to Orthodox Christianity, which is called the Edict of Thessalonica. Remember, it was with Emperor Theodosius in the year 380. So remember, that is the prophecy within the New Testament of the Roman Empire itself and the Caesars becoming Orthodox Christian. And remember, Emperor Theodosius was baptized by the Bishop of Thessaloniki. Also remember, when in their accusation in the book of Acts, where they say that they appealed to the governor of Thessaloniki to attack St. Paul and cause the riot against St. Paul in Thessaloniki. and they were trying to appeal to the governor of the city, because remember, the governor of the city would have been in charge locally of the region, obviously. But remember, in the few hundred years after St. Paul, in the time of the edict, well, not the Edict of Thessalonica, but in the time of the Diocletian persecution, who is martyred in Thessaloniki? The governor of Thessaloniki, who was an Orthodox Christian, that's Saint Demetrius, the Myrgusher of Thessaloniki. So even Saint Demetrius and his martyrdom is so important also. That's why it's very important, all of these connections. Because remember, also Emperor Theodosius was baptized by the Bishop of Thessaloniki, Aios Askolios. So Thessaloniki has a very, very big role to play in the history of the church. And now the fact that we have Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius also coming to Thessaloniki and becoming the apostles to the Slavs is also fulfilling all of this, because it's also fulfilling the role that the Slavic nations will play in in the history of the church in terms of the Orthodox Christian kingdoms. Now, both Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius were very ascetical, very holy saints, but they were also very knowledgeable when it came to church history, and also they knew a lot about the languages. Now, what's interesting is that um, both of them at some point go on a very important mission. One of their early missions was actually to the Khazars. Now remember, by the time of St. Cyril and St. Methodius, the Khazars, at least their leadership, it's not known if it was their entire population, but at least their leadership had converted to rabbinical Judaism at that point. Um, and St. Cyril and Methodius debated very heavily with the Jews within the Khazars and some of the Muslims, because remember, within the Khazar Khanate in this area, which remember, they're claiming such a large area just because this area is very much steppe and it's very easy to just lay claim here. But remember, a lot of the people within this area, there were some Christians. There would have been some would have been obviously the Orthodox Christians in pockets, especially along the Black Sea area. Because remember, they would have overlapped somewhat with the areas originally controlled, like let's say by the Georgians or by the Abkhazians, like we see here, who were Orthodox Christians. Because they're controlling, you can see, parts of the Caucasus Mountains. And also they're very close to Crimea, where this area, remember, we have that Crimea is part of the Eastern Roman Empire, as it had been part of the Roman Empire for centuries and centuries. And even before that, it was Greek, because it was part of the Hellenistic world for centuries, from time immemorial. But anyway, the Khazars within them would have had probably some Monophysites, some Nestorians. Mostly the people would have still been pagan in the shamanic sense, where they practiced what was called Tengriism, which was the prominent Turkic shamanism of their paganism during this time. And we have the leaders of the Khazars who had converted to Judaism at this time. So Saint Cyril and Methodius, though, it is known that they did locally convert many people to Orthodoxy individually. Now the Khazars themselves don't become Orthodox Christian in terms of their leaders. However, eventually, though, remember, this Khanate will collapse. We're not up to that point. That'll just mention in another video. But anyway, on their way to the Khazars, on their journey to evangelize the Khazars, they passed through the area of Crimea, and they actually miraculously was revealed to them the relics of Saint Clement of Rome. Now remember, this is a very important revelation of holy relics, but revelation meaning revealed by the Lord, obviously, because as we recall, remember, Saint Clement was one of the very early bishops of Rome, going all the way back to the 100s AD. Remember, during the time of when the Roman Empire was still pagan. And Saint Clement of Rome is a hierom martyr. Remember, Saint Clement is a hierom martyr of the church. Now remember, Saint Clement also has a lot of important writings. We had Saint Clement's epistle to some of the early like his epistle to, I think it was, might have been Thessalonica or to the Corinthians, I'm not sure. But he has a lot of very important writings that still exist, and they're considered to be patristic writings, the writings of the church fathers, because he considered one of the church fathers from that very early time in the like the 100s. So before the council of the Holy Council of Nicaea. Um, but remember, Saint Clement was actually exiled to Crimea, where Crimea, remember, even at that time, in the 100s, was part of the Roman Empire. So he was exiled here, and he was martyred. And he was martyred where he was, his body was thrown, it was tied to an anchor and thrown into the Black Sea. And Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius, actually, it's revealed his holy relics, including the anchor, the anchor. So this was a very great revelation by the Lord. And it probably wasn't a coincidence, because St. Clement of Rome was an early bishop of Rome, remember, and he was a holy martyr. And remember what was happening with Rome at this time as they were falling further and further into heresy, even though there were some glimmers of kind of going against the Frankish influence. Remember, we have, of course, the whole point is that during this period before 1054, the whole Orthodox Church was praying and praying and praying for the repentance of and that the innovations within Rome's patriarchate and within the Franks would be overthrown, and that there would be a great triumph of orthodoxy. And remember, we have as proof of this the fact that Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius was revealed to them the relics of a bishop of Rome, because remember, it was, of course, the prayers, of course, that this would happen. But of course, we have a triumph of orthodoxy happening, because we have, obviously, the conversion of the Bulgarians to orthodoxy of basically Constantinople, and not the innovations of Rome. And of course, the same happens with Great Moravia itself. Now, remember, when it comes to to the language aspect, that's what I'm going to discuss now. Because remember, in the time of the king of Moravia, his name was Prince Rastislav, or Saint Rastislav of the Moravians, and he had a very close relationship with the king of East Francia, who was called Louis the German, who is actually the grandson of Charlemagne. Now, Louis the German was uh, trying to get, obviously, the Moravians to become Christian, but through them, to become part of them. And they were sending a lot of the Latin-speaking clergy at this point into the Moravians, but insisting that they use Latin only and not the Slavic dialects. And what happens is that King Rastislav appeals then to St. Photios of Constantinople, where St. Photios sends St. Cyril and St. Methodius to Great Moravia to help convert the Slavs. But the difference is, of course, that, remember, being from Thessaloniki, St. Cyril and St. Methodius were already very much acquainted with the Slavic dialects, because remember, the Slavic languages, or the dialects of that time, were not only spoken within the Slavic polities, they were also heavily spoken within the Eastern Roman Empire, even in the areas that we consider to be Greece today. Because going back to a few hundred years before this, when the Slavic tribes were coming down into the Balkans, like I said in one of the previous videos, the border of the Eastern Roman Empire was basically not even there, because there were times when the people would just literally just waltz right over the border with it wasn't even there. It was not really, this border in the Balkans was really not very much enforced. So a lot of the Slavic tribes had settled down even into many parts of mainland Greece, even into parts of Peloponnesos. There were the Ezerites. There was another small Slavic tribe, and within Thessaloniki there was a Slavic-speaking population that lived alongside the Greek population. Now, many of the ones that would have lived in this area individually would have become Orthodox. So Saint Cyril and Cyril and Methodius were both very much acquainted with the Slavic dialects. So now within Bulgaria itself and within the Slavic-speaking peoples, now remember the old Bulgar language had really much become extinct, and the Bulgar language was a Turkic language, but it had pretty much become extinct as most of the Bulgarians really spoke a Slavic language because it really identified as a Slavic state. Um, Now, of course, there was somewhat of a common dialect or a Kini or Koine Slavic dialect called Old Slavic that had developed within the southern parts of the Balkans and Thessaloniki area. And the dialect became the basis for the Old Church Slavonic dialect, where as the Bulgarians and the Moravians and the other Slavic kingdoms gradually become Orthodox, they use as a liturgical language the Old Slavic language. Remember, because it's important for the people to understand. Now, obviously, in the Eastern Roman Empire, where everybody speaks Greek, it's fine for the Divine Liturgy to be in Greek. Remember, it's the authoritative language of the Holy Scriptures and the Church Fathers, and it was understood by the population. But when you have people like the Slavs, it's not feasible to just expect them to be able to understand Greek in lieu of becoming Christian. Because then that will just become an obstacle to their salvation. So remember, the church understood that it had to be that they had to have the Divine Liturgy and the Holy Scriptures in their language, the language that they can understand. Now remember, obviously people like Louis the German and the clergy within the East Francia, that was like not on their minds because as they're falling into heresy, they have this thing where they want to only use Latin because they were doing that for deceptive reasons, obviously, because of all of the heretical innovations that were happening at this point within the Franks. Now, in order to facilitate literacy and to facilitate the conversion of the Slavic peoples to Orthodoxy, remember, including the Bulgarians, including all of these, the people now that are coming to Orthodoxy, in order to facilitate literacy and the reading of the Slavonic language, it was necessary to create a brand new alphabet. Now, remember, if you go back to the earlier times in history and in church history, like let's say obviously let's say the time of the Holy Apostles. Remember, there were very few languages that had a written form. Obviously, Greek had it. The old Semitic languages like Aramaic and Hebrew obviously had it. Latin had the Latin alphabet. But a lot of other languages, like the Germanic languages, they didn't have it. Now, eventually, the Germanic languages, there was an attempt by an earlier time to create like the Goth alphabet, but for the most part, the Germanic languages ended up just adopting the Latin alphabet, which is like English today. English is a Germanic language. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. That's basically the Latin alphabet with some minor modifications. But now for the Slavic people, because of the way its phonology is, and because its phonology is very rich, it doesn't the Greek alphabet and the Latin alphabet don't easily graft onto Slavic phonology, because remember, Slavic has a lot of sounds like zh, ch, z, and a lot of different vowels that Greek doesn't have. So it's a little difficult to kind of just use Greek by itself. So it was necessary to create a new alphabet. Now, the first alphabet that was created by Saint Cyril was called the Glagolitic alphabet, or Glagolitsa. Now, here is an example of some of the original shapes of the Glagolitic. In earlier times, there was a more rounded form, and in later forms, it was a more square form. Although you can see on this side here on the left is the more rounded form, and the angular form is like the more squarey form. And they had names, just like the way, like, you know, if you look at some of the videos on this channel, where I kind of mentioned how some of like the names from the Holy Scriptures, especially the ones originating in Hebrew, where the Hebrew alphabet originally, obviously its names, and obviously where it's shared by the Greek alphabet, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta. In Hebrew, it's Aleph, Beth, Gimel, Dalet. They had names that all expressed the Orthodox confession of faith. And you could see those videos on that topic in the other playlists on this channel. But you can see here that the saints were very aware of that. The church fathers do mention that, especially some of the church fathers that had spoke the Semitic languages. Saint Isaac the Syrian mentions the letters because remember the Syriac would have had the same letters as Hebrew, where they knew that their meaning. Saint John of Damascus mentions this many times. And when it comes to the etymology, so now Saint Cyril, and Saint Methodius were also very much aware of this. So when they created the Glagolitic alphabet, they created it not only with a glyph, the letters themselves, but with that they would also have a meaning behind them. So we have here the first letter was like as, buki. Let me just go down. As we see here, viede, glagoli, dobro jest, żywiete, dzielo, zemlia, ije. Remember, these are the same letters that will be in what will be in the Cyrillic alphabet. But this is the original, the Glagolitic alphabet came first. It's thought. Oh, and we can see some of the shapes. It looks like something very, very different. But this is Glagolitsa. And there are many examples of Glagolitsa in many, many manuscripts because this was the dominant written form in the early times in Orthodox Bulgaria and through parts of Great Moravia at the same time. An example is for example here. Here's an example of the Lord's Prayer in Glagolitsa. This is the earlier angular form, and this is the later more square kind of form. Then we have also, let's see, there's another example here. I mean, sometimes Wikipedia is good for like these pictures. Here we have, this looks like the Holy Scriptures translated into the Slavonic, but we're using this might be from Old Bulgaria, using the Glagolitic alphabet. Now, of course, eventually the Cyrillic alphabet that we know today becomes the actual dominant alphabet. And here is just an example of the Cyrillic alphabet as we would still see today in Old Church Slavonic. And of course, it retains the same names that we saw in the Glagolitic, so that as, buk, viede, glagoli, dobro, those are still correspond with these letters also. And of course, remember, like the word "as" was the Slavic word for "I," like the first person. The "buk" meant book, like a collection of letters. Dobro meaning the word for good, like dobre in the Slavic languages. Glagoli meaning like to speak or like tongue. So they all had a meaning basically. That's how this was constructed with a full numerical and full alphabetic system. Now the Glagolitic alphabet came in around 863, and then but then later, like about 20 years later, we have the Cyrillic alphabet, the Kyrillica, which became the dominant. Now the Cyrillic alphabet, the only difference is that the letters kind of stayed a little bit closer to the Greek letters. So there are some letters, but the letter where the sh sound and the ts sound are very, very similar graphically to the Hebrew and Syriac letters for like shin and sadi. So there could have been some influence for some of those sounds onto the Slavonic alphabet also. But now, while Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius were in Great Moravia, they trained a lot of the Slavonic-speaking clergy. Many people were baptized, but of course, the clergy coming from the East Franks, right next door, the Latin clergy, were making a lot of problems, especially the use of the Glagolitic and Cyrillic alphabets. And and of course they wanted to spread the heresies that were happening with the Filioque, etc. So at some point around the year 867, that's where I kind of stopped this map. Both St. Cyril and St. Methodius went to Rome to appeal to the Bishop of Rome, to the Pope at the time, against the Franks. Because remember, there was this hope that maybe the bishops of Rome would kind of go against what the Frankish clergy were saying. Because there was still, like I said, some differences between the two. And also remember, Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius brought the relics of Saint Clement of Rome back to Rome. So there was also, remember, the prayers of Saint Clement also in all of this that was going on. But the good thing was that actually Pope Hadrian II actually approved their use of the liturgy in Slavonic at the time. Now remember, Saint Cyril reposes in Rome in around the year 869. I'll just move a little forward to get to that point. And then, now remember, as time goes on with Saint Methodius, he's actually imprisoned for his. Now remember, Saint Methodius became the bishop of Sirmium, which is a very old city, had been part of the Roman Empire from early times, part of the Eastern Roman Empire, but at this point it was under the Serbians, and it becomes an important city within the Serbians. And Saint Methodius becomes bishop there, but at some point he's actually imprisoned by some of the Frankish clergy, because again they were fighting his use of the Slavonic, even after the Bishop of Rome, Pope Hadrian II, actually did bless their use of it and actually agreed with it. But the Franks were steadfast in their determination not to suppress this in these areas, because they're trying to politically also gain control in these areas, which fortunately this doesn't happen. And then later Pope John VIII, who, remember, Pope John VIII was the same one that had that entered into the agreement with Saint Photios of Constantinople. Remember, John VIII. Remember, we consider him to be the last of the somewhat good popes during this period. And interestingly, possibly all of this that he had this agreement, this peace. Remember, where also communion was restored between Rome and Constantinople. Remember, during the same year, after the brief schism. Remember, when Saint Photios was deposed at that time, a few years earlier. But remember, communion between Rome and Constantinople was restored at the same time as Pope John VIII, because also remember, at the same time, Pope John VIII released Saint Methodius from prison, and he, Pope John VIII, also reaffirmed what Hadrian II had said, and he approved of the use of the Slavonic liturgy. So remember, all of this. Remember, this is a big temptation, a big battle that's going on among the Orthodox. Remember, this is all happening, all of this attack coming from really the Diavolos against both Rome and Constantinople that had been happening for a very long time now. Because remember, the other patriarchates had already been under Muslim rule, even though, of course, they were still Orthodox and had many saints. They were no longer politically under an Orthodox Christian state anymore, because they had been under Muslim rule since the beginning of Islam. So only Rome and Constantinople were not under Islam. But at first, both Rome and Constantinople were part of the Eastern Roman Empire. But like I mentioned in the last few videos, what happened with Rome and Constantinople, because remember, Constantinople had the iconoclasm first. But as Rome is falling further and further into heresy, remember, it's a big battle. It's a battle for Rome's patriarchate. And it's a very, very big temptation that's happening during this time, especially with the control that the Franks falling into heresy and enforcing this on Rome. It's a big mess. So this was you could see that the Rome and Constantinople coming into this brief communion that lasts until 1054. You could see it was through the prayers no doubt, of even Saint Clement of Rome, the hieromartyr of the 2nd century, and of course the prayers of Saint Cyril, who had just reposed in Rome a few years earlier, and all of the saints, of course, and the prayers of the All Holy Theotokos, to keep it so that at least there would be this hope that they wouldn't fall away. But unfortunately, we know what happens in the year 1054. Unfortunately, now eventually in the 880s, Saint Methodius um, is exiled out of Great Moravia by the East Francia, the German Latin speaking clergy, and he escapes and goes to Bulgaria, and he establishes the great literary school of Preslav, which became a very literary center, which became basically the powerhouse of all of the translations and the literary aspects of the Slavic, as the people are becoming more and more literate uh, through the Bulgarian Empire and beyond. Now, and of course, now the disciples of Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius within the Balkans, we know, are great saints like Saint Clement of Ohrid, the region in western Bulgaria, and also Saint Naum. So remember, now we have a new line of very great saints among the Slavic people, and this will continue as eventually. Remember, when the Rus in the 100 years after this will also become Orthodox, but that's for the next few videos. That's too much to discuss in this video. But of course, this is why Saint Cyril and Saint Methodius are so important in the history of the church, as they are considered to be, of course, equal to the apostles. They are the apostles to the Slavs. And in the next video, I'm going to discuss a little bit of now the dynamic between Bulgaria and the Eastern Roman Empire politically, which becomes quite tumultuous, unfortunately. But that's for the next video. And then we will also then later discuss the conversion of the Rus to Orthodoxy. But that's all for now. Glory to God. Doxa Tho Theo.